Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our sixth session of our third annual Journalism Under Fire Conference. I'm Sandy Campbell. I'm the Executive Director of the Santa Fe Council on International Relations. We're thrilled to have you with us tonight for this double header. Let me give a quick shout out to two of our sponsors of this event, the New Mexico Humanities Council and the National Endowment for the Humanities. We're tremendously grateful for your support and your vision, and we're so thankful for how the humanities enrich all of our lives. Couple quick housekeeping notes. By now, all of you out there should have your conference booklet and the speaker compendium, which provides all kinds of resources and links and other fun stuff related to all our speakers. If you don't, check out the website. It's all there, and I encourage you to take a look because there's a lot of really interesting information there. Tomorrow, as many of you know, for those who have an all-conference ticket pass, for our students, for journalists, for teachers, we're having an interactive conference session with Dana Priest and myself. Bring your questions, bring your thoughts, bring your observations from the first week of the conference. We'd love to hear from you. Let's have some great dialogue on so many of the different things that have been discussed over this current week, including the two sessions coming up tonight. As I said, tonight we have two sessions back to back. In the second session, Dana Priest will once again take the moderator chair, and she will be interviewing the two political cartoonists, Jack Oman of the Sacramento Bee and Matt Worker from Politico. We're going to show a number of their cartoons, and I guarantee you we're going to have a lot of fun doing that. But first up is our panel on covering social crisis. And we have a wonderful panel lined up. Russell Contreras of the Associated Press is our moderator tonight, and he has disappeared from my screen. Russ, there you are. How are you, Russ? Good to see you. How's life in the big city?
Just fine, man. It's so big here. I think I got coyotes and roadrunners who just passed by. So a lot of fun.
How has your election withdrawal gone?
It's gone great. So I'm trying to adjust and decompress by watching stuff that have nothing to do with elections. A lot of light stuff like HBO's Lovecraft County and The Third Day. Really light stuff that deal with also race. No, but that's actually very heavy stuff, but trying to get me out of the way of the everyday coverage of the horse race and the aftermath of the election. So that's what I'm trying to decompress that way.
Right on. Well, thanks for doing this. I will turn the panel over to you folks. Please enter your questions in the Q&A button, and we will get to them at around 6:15 our time. Russ, over to you. Welcome, gentlemen. I look forward to a great conversation.
And thank you for the Santa Fe Council here for International Relations. We have a wonderful panel here today, and it is perfect, especially after the elections. And especially we have two gentlemen here who are extraordinary journalists and extraordinary thinkers, and I'm honored to be part of it. And I shall also note that all three of us are alum of the Boston Globe, so we share that in common. First off, I want to introduce Astead Herndon. He is a national political reporter for the New York Times and a political analyst for CNN. He covered the 2020 presidential election. I should say covers because it's technically not over. He previously was an integral part of the Times Midtown coverage team with a special emphasis on grassroots campaigning and stories about race and identity. He is a former Washington bureau chief, and as I mentioned, he was a City Hall reporter for the Boston Globe.
Not a bureau chief. I can't steal Chris Rowland's title.
But excuse me, not bureau chief. Sorry, that's my fault. You were at the bureau. My fault. Thanks for correcting me. And Wesley Lowery, the other reporter here, somebody that I've known since our days at NBJ when he was a student. He's the author of A New Era in American Racial Justice Movement and also They Can't Kill Us All, a book I saw in Paris and actually sent him a screenshot of it when I saw it at the Shakespeare bookstore. And I personally put it in a spot where more people could get it, and I did see people buy the book, by the way. So I need my cut there. He has twice been a member of teams awarded the Pulitzer Prize, and he, as I mentioned, started at the Boston Globe and later went to the Washington Post, where he covered police violence and helped put together a database that many of us covering police shootings used. It was an extensive one that covered shootings across the country. His work has also appeared in the LA Times, Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and he currently is with 60 Minutes. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks for having us.
Thanks. I'm going to start off here. Before we get into the coverage of elections and recently, take me back 4 years ago. Where were you in 2015, 2016? And tell us what has changed from today, not just in terms of your coverage, but you personally. How have you were able to survive this last 4 years? Has it been a roller coaster? Have you dust this off your shoulders? How have you transformed in the last 4 years? And I'll start with you, Wesley.
Sure. That's an interesting question. When I think back 4 years ago, frankly, with what I write about, I was in the midst of an even more hectic time than currently. 4 years ago was 2015 going into 2016. And so 4 years ago, that meant I was in South Carolina covering Walter Scott, was down in Texas covering Sandra Bland, Baltimore covering Freddie Gray. As 15 turned to 16, was covering Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, and trying to wrap my hands and arms around what was this emergent protest movement among young Black. That's a little overly reductive. And what would its impact be? At the time, it had very much Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives broadly, had become one of the more powerful forces, certainly one of the most powerful grassroots forces in Democratic politics. You were seeing Secretary Clinton, who would go on to win the nomination, as well as Bernie Sanders, taking meetings with folks, being shifted on their platforms, being protested and demonstrating against. You were seeing the Obama White House invite activists in. And there was this feeling, certainly among many of the young activists that I covered, of some relative invincibility. Now, that was, of course, predicated on the belief that Hillary Clinton would win the election. And when she did not, you suddenly saw a lot of soul searching in the space that I write about. A lot of young folks and activists who had very publicly been not only critical of Hillary Clinton, but some of whom had suggested there wasn't much of a difference between her and Donald Trump. Folks who had come up in activism in an era of Obama in which they were used to having a president who invited them in for coffee versus a president who would very likely lock them up and ship them out. And so it's been a fascinating few years to try to cover these issues and these movements and their intersections with our politics. What's also interesting is that it's always very different to cover something that's not happening versus something that is happening. I don't mean that in terms of the protests, but I mean that in terms of during the Obama administration, you were seeing investigations launched into police departments. You were seeing public conversations around these issues, while the Trump administration, I believe, only launched a single investigation into a single police department during his 4 years, and so compared to dozens during the Obama years. And so you saw a drastic shift. What was also true was, I was coming out of my first big data project, the Fatal Force Project, won the Pulitzer. So it was trying to figure out how to replicate those types of efforts, how to continue using resources that in the policing and Black Lives Matter space, we were all kind of at a 101 level in 2014 and 15 and 16. And so the thought was, how do we make sure the work continues to be smart, continues to illuminate, continues to ask new questions and provide new information? And so it's been 4 years really of that type of growth and trying to, when I can, avoid politics. But the reality is these issues are at the heart of our politics. And so often I get kind of sucked into it as well.
And Astead, 4 years ago, I didn't even know Stedman yet on Twitter. And this is before you jumped into the midterms. Where were you 4 years ago, and how has that transformation been from 2015, 2016 to today?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very clear period. I mean, the day before the election in 2016, I was covering the Boston City Council for the Boston Globe. We had big issues on the referendum that year. Talks about tax increases to go to affordable housing and things like that. And I remember that was my election day duty, was to cover the kind of local referendums that were happening. But I'll never forget, there was this meeting that we had at the Globe where folks were kind of game planning the election day. And it was all based on this assumption of Hillary Clinton's victory. And by the next morning when we woke up, I had like 6 mixed calls from bosses, and the word was, that they had not planned for a Trump transition, and that they had an opening in the Globe Washington bureau, and that the second I heard that voicemail, I should get there. And I think that from that moment to now is a 4 years of big transition, and is one really wrestling with the kind of big political questions that are in front of us. And so first, I was in the Washington bureau of the Boston Globe, in those Sean Spicer, Anthony Scaramucci press conferences and the like. But the last 3 years have been focused around the elections and traveling across the country to tell those stories. And I think that what we know from that is that we have seen a kind of clear arc through the Trump era, one that inspires a level of white grievance among Republican politics that has turned out new folks on the conservative side. One that has inspired a backlash and has seen a real reorientation or realignment among suburban folks, among a more college-educated sect, among inspiring new pockets of people of color to come out to the process. I think that that's been the clear thing through the last 4 years, is that politics has become something that's seeped into everyone's kind of beat and life and just thought process, partly because of the energy and that Donald Trump sucks out of the room. And that has been something that I think we all have been kind of wrestling with, is what's the best way to tell these stories that are true to the moment that we're in, but at the same time recognize not just the kind of top-down palace intrigue type of journalism, but one that actually deals with the effects that this administration has had on folks' lives.
And before we get to some of the social crisis that we encountered on the field, all three of us come from institutions that, let's just say, have been slow to diversify and slow to bring voices from our communities. When Donald Trump took over and he was saying things that we now can label as racist, were your institutions or your newsrooms, were they open to new voices and listening to us as we would say, hey, look, we need to cover that, not as some people think what he just said is racist, but that was a racist comment. Were they open to those ideas and exploring that and saying, no, we got to look at something that's systemic here? Wes, how did they respond to you when you heard these things when the administration took office?
Well, look, I think a lot of newsrooms, and I should say probably most major newsrooms, felt as if they had missed something. And so there was this feeling of franticness that they needed to go figure out a thing. I think that presented a lot of opportunity. Unfortunately, I think a lot of places missed some of the opportunity that was presented for us, certainly in those early days. I mean, I would actually suggest it wasn't until Charlottesville in 2017 that a lot of folks started getting it more. That first year of the Trump presidency, frankly, I don't know that anyone was doing the best of job trying to figure out what he was and what he meant. There was this panic to try to cover the quote-unquote white working class, despite the fact that Trump's 2016 coalition was not a working class coalition. Rather, it was just a white coalition. He wanted all the rich white people too. And there weren't very many bylines from Wall Street about how all these people were willing to vote for someone who was running on a nativist platform. There was a lot of stuff from diners across the country. I think two things can be true at once. I think it can definitely be true that we don't always do the best job in our national purchase of being out in the country and covering these stories and telling them. And also that we don't always do the best job when we go out to tell the stories of covering the stories and telling them. And so I thought there was some push and pull there. I also thought that there was some real difficulty in being willing to tell clear truths. I mean, Donald Trump had spent decades showing us all who he was. And I think there were times where we were too hesitant, we being the collective media, to just tell the truth. The thing he said yesterday was racist. That's what it was. And I think that that was not the, I don't think that was the best. I think that it took so long and so much repetition. I recently rewatched the Michelle Wolf performance from the White House Correspondents' Dinner in 17, 18. I was there and was one of the people laughing. And I remember the kind of clutching of pearls and rendering of garments because she had called Sarah Huckabee Sanders a liar and made a joke. It was about her eyeshadow, but it was how could we do this? So much so that the White House Correspondents' Dinner no longer has comedians because everyone was so outraged. When Sarah Huckabee Sanders stepped down from the White House a year later, Margaret Sullivan, the leading media critic in the country, wrote, yeah, that lady was a liar. that so often the media, we get to understand this about ourselves as an institution, are not leading indicators, rather we're following indicators. It takes us till Friday to say the thing that everyone knew on Tuesday too often. And I think that unfortunately, because of the relative monochromaticness of our newsrooms and our leadership of our newsrooms, very often we can be a little slow to provide clarity to our readers, or we can be too muted. This is how you end up with headlines like "Trump urges unity over racism," when in fact the president is the one pouring the gasoline. That we can take too dispassionate. Is not the word I want, but we can seek neutrality when there are stories that are not in fact neutral. And I think that's something the media really struggled with during the Trump administration, even if there was improvement over time.
And instead, I've been jealous over the years of the stories you covered, and I'm sometimes just assumed that you've done it so easily that these battles in the newsrooms were very easy for you. They accepted your story ideas.
Right.
That was that so? Or was there a battle for you?
I mean, I don't think any of this has been easy for any of us. I mean, I can think back from the Globe to even at the Times. I mean, there has been a level of proof that has always historically, and a burden of proof that has historically fallen on particularly people of color to clear, that is not one that's given to other folks when we're talking about these issues. I think about the comfort that journalists have in calling out the White House when it comes to coronavirus, right? Because it feels like something that has objective facts, objective guidelines, and can say that the thing that is coming from the White House is not based in fact and truth. Those things have been clear about race and identity from this White House forever. It is the journalists who are uncomfortable and kind of ill-equipped to really handle that level of context and that is required to do that level of work. And I think that the argument I always say when we talk about using words like racist and the like when it comes to this is that it's very rare that you have people who disagree with you on the facts of it, right? You very rarely have someone who say you shouldn't use the word because they don't think what was coming from the White House or what was coming from this was not racist. It's about the feeling that it invokes on readers. It's about the kind of PR question. It's about this other thing when we know the kind of clearest mission that we have in reporting is to clarity, and that does not end when we just talk about race. And so, no, it hasn't been an easy thing. But I think that what I look for in institutions, whether it's the ones I work at or others, is like, is there an ability to convince someone based on reporting? And I think that is what I think that is what we can all ask for as journalists, because I trust that if I go there and I do the type of work and I talk to folks, we'll get the reporting that justifies this stuff. We'll have people be explicit about the reasons why they're supporting Trump. I'm kind of a defender of the diner story. I think that it is one that is framed improperly, oftentimes reported improperly, and not coupled with the level of context that we need. But there's nothing inherent about going to those places and talking with people that's wrong. It's that it's usually extrapolated poorly. It's that it's usually framed in this way of doing work for people that doesn't get to the actual realness of why someone is supporting Trump and the like. And I think that is actually a hard level to get to. Sometimes I think our white colleagues have a lack of imagination. That if you go to these people and you ask them about why this thing is happening, that's somehow going too far. If they won't engage with you on that topic. I talk to Trump supporters all the time, and whiteness and race is not a topic they are uncomfortable with. It is a topic that is an active part of their political decision-making process. It is up to journalists and reporters to be comfortable enough with ourselves to do that work and speak to them, because otherwise we're missing what is clearly going on here, which is a president who is the biggest practitioner of identity politics in the country. And if we do not engage on that level, then that means what we are missing the point.
Staying with you on that, Stead, that many of my mentors would warn me and say, keep in mind, you entering the space of journalism and reporting, you by yourself, just existing, are a political statement that you're going to enter this field and ask questions. Did you get pushback walking to those Trump supporters and saying, one, I'm at the New York Times. Two, obviously, I'm a Black man. And I'm asking you these questions about whiteness. Did they open up to you? Yeah. Was it resistance? Was there any sort of animosity, especially these past 4 years? What was your interaction in those spaces?
I mean, it's stretched the gamut. There's people who you would be shocked at the level of niceness and comfort that people bring you into their homes and life. There are things that people say to me that you would also be shocked about. I mean, someone called Black people the N word to me on Sunday. Like this is not something that is not. As I talk to particularly Black journalists, I think that there is an unavoidable amount of intense emotional labor that comes with us doing that work, and a level of micro and sometimes macro aggression that you are going to have to deal with. And I understand the folks who do not want to be a part of something that requires taking that on. But I think that we cannot just cede that level of reporting and that group of people only to white journalists and to people who won't ask those questions. And so for me, whether I'm having to deal with like kind of extra level of taking something on is not as important as being there and being able to do that work. And so, yeah, I mean, I have had experiences over the last 4 years where, it's kind of funny. I say 70% of the time, it's probably better than you would imagine and easier than you imagine. And then there's like a 30% of the time where it's much worse and quite tenuous. And I think that kind of level of negotiation is something that it comes along with the territory. But here, we're not owed people's thoughts. We're not owed people's time. And I think doing that work to earn folks' trust to get them to be explicit and get them to be kind of clear-eyed is something that I take pride in, not only when talking to white people or Trump supporters or the like, but talking to people of color who all have very good reasons to distrust media and who have been legitimately harmed by places like the New York Times and the like. And I think that kind of work is something that when we go to those people and we make a kind of clear-eyed and transparent case about why we're there and what we're doing, you can earn that trust in ways that I think might surprise people.
And Wes, did you also find the niceness when you went on the campaign trail there with some folks, especially among some of the Trump supporters?
Certainly. I mean, Astead has much more experience on the trail than I do, in part because I've very deliberately avoided being anywhere near that, right? But that said, I've spent a fair amount of time talking to Trump supporters. I've spent a lot of, covering Black Lives Matter. I've spent a lot of time with cops, I talk to cops every day, white cops, not just the woke cops, the other cops. They all text me. And so the reality is, and this is true of any group of people, right? I say this every time I talk to student journalists. It's remarkable what people will tell you if you ask them. Most people want to talk. Most people want to be helpful. Most people are willing to give you information. That's not to say there's not a hostility, and that's not to say there aren't moments of frustration or anger or danger even. But I do think people are willing to have those conversations. I do want to echo what Astead said, though, even about the diner stories. I think he drills into a point that's really important, that all these things are about the execution. It's about how you carry out these stories, what questions you ask. My good friend, the nonfiction critic at the Post, Carlos Lozado, has a book out currently that reviews all of the Trump books that came out during the era. And he notes that the same white working class guy shows up in two different books, and his motivations are ascribed completely the opposite. In the book written by the more conservative leaning, out to explain that these people aren't all racist, this person is completely economically aggrieved and these are the only reasons. In the other book, the guy immediately starts talking about racial grievance, right? That it's one of the reasons having different types of reporters in a newsroom is important, because look, we all ask questions differently. We all engage questions differently. That Black Americans and other minorities have never had the opportunity to not discuss race or not think about it. And so the reality is a lot of us are very comfortable talking about it as reporters. While I have no problem when I talk to the police officer, the police chief, saying, isn't it kind of racist you shot that Black guy in the back? And that's how I ask them the question. And I think that a lot of my other colleagues, my white colleagues, might not always feel the ability to speak so frankly or directly, which means they end up getting answers that aren't as direct. Beyond that, though, I think that we have to, we have to be willing to ask these questions directly. We have to appreciate the level to which race is an expertise. Look, I'm capable of writing a climate story, I am sure. Is that story going to be executed as well as my colleagues who are full-time climate reporters? Are they going to ask all the right questions? Am I going to understand all of the context? I'm capable of it, right? But it's a different level of difficulty. Very often, the folks in newsrooms who cover issues of race aren't seen as having an expertise. It's thought that we're just opinionated or interested in it, but in reality, the amount of time and research and conversations and panels and books that you have to understand the context in which things fit in order to properly present these the reporting that you end up getting in your notebook. And I think very often, not everyone across the newsroom has that expertise. Those who have it, that expertise is not respected. And too often, the editors running such coverage don't have that expertise either. And I think that's often how we end up with some of the things that are more bungled.
Wesley, on that note, go ahead, Stan.
Just quickly, I mean, I'm thinking about something this weekend. I was in West Texas, and in this very rural community, and I sometimes sometimes people think you're going up to these folks and asking about race, and I'm like, as a function of your identity, people just talk to you about it. I mean, being a Black person who shows up in a community of no Black people, I walked up to this lady at a church, not even planning to ask about race, and the first words out of her mouth was about how her father had Black employees growing up, and she loves Black people. And so like there is like not and actually sometimes like you're upset, like folks seeing your identity and projecting this out there is actually inconvenient for the reporting that you're trying to do. But it's just like we do not have the privilege of ignoring the thing as some other colleagues do. And I think that oftentimes what some people can project is these people aren't thinking about it. It's just that you all in your shared whiteness have the ability to avoid it.
You could have been asking about oil prices or oil field, and the minute things you want to talk about race and say, my dad employed Black people, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That had nothing to do with what you were going to ask.
I love Black people, and that's why. And I was like, I literally said, I do too. Like I don't. Hey,
yeah, we all do, right? Yeah. And Wesley, I mean, I remember you. We were at the Boston Globe. You were starting off, but you hit the ground running during the Boston Marathon bombing and the aftermath on it. And it was some really intense things that you were reporting and covering on Twitter. I mean, you were it was in real time. And then you go to Ferguson, and then you do some other things. And the one thing I kept thinking is like the OG looking at this young cat breaking these stories is, I hope this dude is doing okay. I hope he's not, you're kicking ass, you're doing what you're on a professional, but then I'm worried about you personally. As someone who was an NEBJ and NHJ, I couldn't help but have that. How did you handle this as a reporter with all this, and they're doing it professionally? You have to go home and digest all this. How did you handle this without going mad and having a breakdown?
Oh, there were many breakdowns. I think that and I think that frankly, I'm just now starting to fully be in the position where I've been through these types of stories, high trauma, high drama stories, enough that I know where my limits are, what I need, how to best utilize my skills and abilities, how not to waste my time, how to separate my professional life from my personal life. But it is difficult. I think that newsroom culture, I wanted to be a newspaper reporter from the time I was 12 or 13 years old, right? I watched all the movies, read all the books, was like the only 14-year-old with a bookmark on his computer for Pointer. Like I was like really about journalism for a very long time. I was such a nerd. But because of that, I really had a sense in a lot of ways of newsroom culture. And newsroom culture, especially newspaper culture, for a long time is kind of, we've all been through it, suck it up, stay late, show up early in the morning, go to the next one, do the next thing. And look, part of that is what attracts all of us, because, journalists, many of us have a lot of very shared personality traits. And it's that the high you get from the adrenaline, the speed, the unpredictability, all of those things are what a lot of things that attract us to this job. The ability to be so close to the news and to see things like that. But we don't always talk about the extent to which we all need to be aware that our job is a job, right? Even if as a profession, it is still a job, that our lives are equally important, our mental health is important, our finances are important, that perhaps it's not quaint, the colleague you have who's never filed expenses and his house is in foreclosure, perhaps like someone should leave from a financial advisor, right? And I do think that sometimes there's a newsroom culture that kind of glorifies or mystifies all the newsroom characters who we all love. without necessarily thinking about how do we support each other in those areas and those regions. I mean, what's also true, I think, especially for young journalists in this moment, people who've come up in the era of social media, of kind of having to be all things to all people, to kind of need to be weighing in or sharing information on basically every news story and all these, that there can be a loss of perspective. That if I'm not writing about something, I don't really need to be weighing in on it. If it's adjacent to my expertise, I can go off the internet for a few days, a few weeks, a few months, and the reality is I'm a hyper news consumer. I'm not going to miss anything. I'm going to know what happened. And I think that sometimes there can be an addiction, glorification of this on the news cycle, on the news cycle, on the news cycle. That one, it's crazy making. And two, for me at least, often gets in the way of me doing my best work. I do my best work very often when I go into a cave for a bit and then pop up with something, as opposed to being so busy following the news that I don't have enough time to make it.
And instead, you mentioned before, the way you digest from politics is when you're listening to podcasts, you may not listen to a podcast about politics. You're listening to a podcast about the Hotspurs, right? Or English soccer. Is something that you're listening to music. How important is that for you? I mean, because I always thought political reporters, this is all they do. They eat, drink, and sleep this stuff. But you found a formula. What is that formula?
I mean, I think that the way that people come to politics is multifaceted, and it's not through the kind of hyper obsessive lens that a lot of times the political class is coming to this. And I think that you have to be able, as a political reporter, if you're going to be a good one, in my opinion, you need to understand both sides of that coin. You need to know how campaigns are thinking. You need to know the kind of thinking of the candidates and the like. But you also have to understand how folks are coming to the election. And that is sometimes through pop culture. That's sometimes through kind of only a tangential relationship with the news. And I think that as I find it actually a thing that makes me better in my job is to be well-rounded. And so my only rule about podcasts is it can be nothing to do with the presidential election. My only rule about just things I do for enjoyment, so sometimes someone, even people, I mean, maybe I'm going to get in trouble with this. I don't like the daily, it's way too much Trump consumption for me. It's actually an overload of information that I feel like I can already get from just reading the newspaper, right? And so that's not something and I think that also there are personal things too. I can say that the difference between the kind of work that I do and what I know that Wes does is that I haven't watched any of those police shootings since Walter Scott. I remember the moment after Walter Scott thinking that was a level of emotional trauma that I felt like I didn't need to put myself through. And I also felt that as a political reporter, our work is related to that, but it's not necessarily, I actually haven't watched the George Floyd video, period. And I went to the memorial, I wrote about it, I know about those things, but actually found it things that I was wanting to avoid because I felt like it was adding a level of weight that I didn't actually need for the work and was weighing on me in a person way that I did not find helpful. And so I try to create those boundaries that allow me to keep going. But I think that we all have to find where that line is. And I think especially for folks who are involved in journalism and news, there can be people, as Wes said, there can be a kind of industry push that makes you think that you have to be involved in everything, that you have to know, and that's actually lots of times not true. And I know that there are some times when kind of breaking news is rolling, when I think this is not helpful, and thinking about Twitter specifically. Reading every kind of incremental update is actually not that great. I want to tune out. I want to read a story that distills the best information for me, and the actual emotion of that is a way easier thing to digest. And so I think I had to learn that about myself as a news consumer, but also as a reporter to be able to continue to do the work that I think that I want to do the best has to include blocking some stuff out.
Instead, you mentioned social media and Twitter, and I got to say, I mean, all three of us have a presence on social media. There is a line here, and I could say it's safe to say all three of us go to that line, and we may make fun of the line and say we don't care about the line. One tweet I want to mention that was just an excellent use of Twitter. Joe Biden, a few months ago, said that he's asked Obama not to endorse him. You retweeted that, And you said, I've also asked Rihanna not to DM me. And I thought that was just a perfect tweet and a perfect use of that tool. But yet, especially, and I want to say this just bluntly as I can, men of color, our journalists of color, we tend to be under a microscope for our social media posts. And sometimes we are just stating facts or giving kind of an analytical take on things. And yet I sometimes believe that we're unfairly criticized, and we've all gotten the email from the manager saying that's a problematic tweet, so forth and so on. Do you feel sometimes that on your social media presence that you're under a microscope, not just from managers, but from users? They're waiting for you to slip up, to say, oh, there's that bias. That's what I knew. I knew he shouldn't be covering X, Y, and Z. Does that bother you sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we all, I think that we stand in a long tradition of particularly Black reporters who have been cast as biased, who have been told that their viewpoint on the world is one that is activism, and have been pushed aside by a media industry where the lens of objectivity is dominated by white people who have constructed the kind of framework in which we're supposed to operate under. I think that there's a lot of things to think about under there. I mean, I think that I think that Twitter can be a tool to push folks, to push the industry, to kind of say something that you might not be able to say in the paper. I think you should avoid giving away your best ideas on Twitter, and you should report them out and kind of do the work in the place in which you're supposed to do that work on. And I also think that, you have to be, especially when I talk to folks, and I think all of us here know that, is that there is legitimate risk in that behavior. I mean, it is not a kind of hunky-dory thing where, you have voice and you have personality on Twitter and you just have a glide path through your career. The reason why it is not done in that way is because there are repercussions, particularly from institutions who take on that kind of that kind of more rigid view of performing objectivity, especially through nonpartisanship. There are jobs I cannot have and got taken away from. There are emails of bosses and calls into offices that you have to do. I think that it is important to me. I think it's important to all of us. I know for this group to feel as if that we can be ourselves in that work, and that is an important part of representation. It's not just being there, right? But being there in a way that that creates space for others, and being there in a way that's authentic to who you are. And I think that for me, there was a choice very early in journalism that I think I cared more about being myself in the profession than I cared about just being there, period. And I think that there was a lot of reporters who came before who have created those pathways and who have opened doors that we can step and walk through. But I think that work continues, and that part of the reason of why, it's a Rihanna joke one day, but it's a point about racism the next. And I think that can be valuable is that, I think the overarching message is that it's just not the white guys who get to be themselves. It's not just that view of objectivity and fairness that is the only one to do. I think you can be a good journalist, you can be a Black person, and you can be clear-eyed about race all at the same time.
And Wesley, sometimes you tweet something and I'll retweet it in solidarity, knowing that I'm like, this brother's brave. I could never do this. Do you sometimes when you're on social media and you're trying to be yourself, is there a voice in the back of your head saying, you're taking a risk, man? And how do you play that out as you were crafting a response to a story, a response to an event, even a response to your own work? Is there a process that you go through, or is this just something that works organically for you?
There's certainly a process, and I underscore what Astead said, that there's a lot of risk to it. That it's not, but for me, I think there's also a lot of benefit. I have gotten great ideas. I've built friendships. I've found sourcing. I've found a lot of great story ideas. There's a tension. Twitter specifically, there's a tension because Twitter, in a lot of ways, is a chat room. It's something that's happening and playing out in real time, that it makes sense in the context in which you are consuming it and the moment in which you are sending and saying something, both in terms of tone and language and all of these things, that then when stripped and removed from that context, suddenly is hard to dissect. And And so that's something I always want to be cognizant of in those spaces. What I think is also true is that, like Astead said, you don't want to give your best thoughts and ideas away for free. That's not how capitalism works. And so it's important to make sure that you're not doing all your best thinking there. It's also, there's also something to be said about, there's a beauty about having conversations in public and the ability to connect and talk to a bunch of people, but there's also an artificiality to it. Even the three of us who all know each other and are pretty like-minded, this conversation is very different at the bar than it is here on Zoom in public. The language is different. The examples are probably different. And so I think that we forget that sometimes about these online social media spaces, is that there's always a performative aspect to it, no matter which tact you are taking. And so, but I think a few things for me are true, right? I similarly made a decision a long time ago that I was going to be myself in this industry, and if ultimately that wasn't going to work, I'd go be myself in a different one. And that's fine. But I also think that as I went from story to story and publication to publication in that platform grew, that suddenly there comes with that some level of responsibility. That when I'm talking about the industry in those spaces, whether people are upset about it or not, they're reading it. That suddenly there's an outsized ability sometimes to shape and to move conversation and to influence our colleagues, our bosses, if not my bosses, Astead's bosses, so then they do something differently, which then does influence my bosses, right? And so so what I would suggest, frankly, is that it's not even necessarily conversations about race or the pop cultural references and jokes, which certainly gets plenty of eye rolls from colleagues about things, but rather very often it's critique of the industry and discussion of where the industry should go that most riles bosses and most riles colleagues, in part because it's a resetting and a democratization of the power within our industry. That suddenly I don't have to wait 25 years before I have any say in how the Washington Post covers a thing. Or the New York Times covers a thing, or CNN covers this thing, that there's now the immediate ability for there to be feedback, and feedback that can come with the credibility of being attached to a reporter who you like or respect, or someone who works for an outlet. And I think that frustrates and in fact imperils the individual journalist more than anything else, is the media criticism. And so I think that look, I put Twitter every other month, right? It's a space that, frankly, I think we all spend too much time on. I think it erodes our brains in any number of ways, that it does as much bad as it does good. But my critiques are very different than a lot of other folks in that I think it's important that that platform be used for these type of critiques and for us to kind of think out loud and do journalism out loud, and to hear from voices we wouldn't hear from otherwise. But that requires us turning off our defensiveness, which we're not always the best at.
Industries would still be, outlets would still be saying words like racially charged and racially tinged if Twitter didn't shame them out of existence. There are legitimate changes that have come purely because of the pressure that those things apply. And frankly, the people who had the choice to make those, to get that stuff out of there 5-10 years ago, did not do so until it became something that was a PR problem rather than one that was always a journalistic problem.
And I would add, probably Uncle Ben would still be around with us if it wasn't for these social media movements that shamed these companies, right? And said that had us questioning some of these figures.
Certainly. And Jemima, the whole crew.
Yeah. I want to invite Sandy back, but before I do want to mention Astead's piece, if you haven't read it, on Vice President-elect Harris's experience at Howard University and the cracking of that story, and tells us a lot about it. That's some very good journalism there. So I invite everybody to read it. It's one of my favorite pieces of yours, and I really appreciate it. Sandy.
Thank you. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. That was fantastic. We've got some questions from the audience. Folks, if you're out there, type in your questions, and ideally we'll get to them. Astead, I want to start with you. I know recently you were on a trip to talk about the Latinx vote in the election. What was one of the key things you found in those communities in terms of how they responded to the 2020 election?
Well, I think that this is a hard question to answer just purely because of the diversity of the community. it is hard to talk about that group even more so than even others who are going to have a shared voting history and the like. And there are so many ways you can tell this story. I mean, I think the places that were the most surprising, which I guess is where we should start from Tuesday, were probably the real swing towards Trump, both in Miami and in the border communities in Texas. And I think that that had big implications, obviously, in battleground states where Democrats would have had a real shot in Texas had that swing probably not happened in that bigger way. And Biden could have closed the night early, probably, if that swing didn't happen that big in Miami. I think it is still that is still a limited story about that population to say, because you could look at Puerto Ricans in Florida who vote for Biden in big numbers. You can look at Arizona, where he had a pretty decent round of support, even as that state is getting closer. And so I think what we have to say about the way the Latino vote works is that it works in a way that is unique to the demographic groups of anywhere else, and that our kind of reporting and analysis of it has to reflect that. And I don't think that the parties have really reckoned with that, or kind of political coverage has reckoned with that in a way that is necessary. So you had a Democratic nominee who certainly focused a lot of, I don't want to act like this is zero sum, right? It's not as if you talk about Black communities, you're not talking about other communities. But there was a big push coming out, particularly of the Democratic primary, to say that Biden owed his nomination to Black people. And the campaign certainly reflected their language to kind of prioritize those communities. The thing about Black folks is that has been a large, overwhelmingly Democratic voting bloc in a way that is different than any other demographic in America. And for Democrats to appeal to different communities, whether it's AAPI folks in Georgia or whether it's Latino voters in Texas or Florida, they cannot play one note. They have to go and recognize the diversity of those communities and specifically appeal to that. And that is on lots of topics outside of immigration. So that is an answer to say that there is no answer. But I think that that's actually what we have to say when it comes to that group, because the diversity among it is such, for even the reasons why the Cuban vote in Florida and the border communities of Texas both go towards Trump, but those are for the same reasons. And so I think we have to be clear about the way that community functions is one that's going to be a huge storyline going forward in politics, but is one we just don't have the answers to yet.
Let me throw a question over to you, Wes. In your experience, what's the difference between television and print in terms of covering social issues or covering issues of race?
I think there's a drastic difference, and I think that my primary job now is to do on-air work, which is very different than what I've done previously, although I still do a lot of writing. And and very often, I think television news has an outsized imprint, especially cable news, has an outsized imprint on the impression of Americans as it relates to media, when in fact it is not what most meat and potato journalism is, and it operates very different. I spent time as a contributor at CNN. Obviously, now I'm doing over 60 Minutes, and I think that a few things are true, right? And I actually do think that I think our cable networks, especially, owe the public a lot more on a lot of these issues and on this coverage. That cable television is an entertainment enterprise. Its job is to keep you there. It's why they'll put up a 22-hour countdown before a debate. There's no functional use for that at all. It's why you can watch our cable news networks for the last 24 hours and not actually find out any news that happened to the country anywhere. It's solely discussion of what's happening in Washington, because in a moment of political polarization and in a heavily engaged electorate, they know that those topics are addicting, that conflict is addicting, and so it remains that conversation. I remember early in the Trump administration, I was in South Africa for New Year's, 17 into 18. And it was the weekend that Fire and Fury came out, the Michael Wolff book. So it was the only thing that mattered in America for like 2 weeks. And I went, and the Airbnb I was in only had basic broadcast. And so the only news I had was the BBC World News. And I found out about bridges that had collapsed and rivers that had overflowed and education programs and all types of things that were the news. Things that matter, and on occasion they go, yeah, there was this book came out in the U.S. and they're all talking about that, and they go back to the news. I think that is really important. I think that our job more, I remember as I watched the election coverage, and I had a lot of friends who were involved in the election coverage, and I think there are a lot of really quality journalists who are working in broadcast. But I remember watching and thinking, in these segments in between the votes being dropped, it'd be really awesome to watch a 10-minute piece that had been filed from Georgia about what the lines were like, or someone who was like, there was this massive news event had happened, and we were finding out actually almost nothing about what actually happened during the day. We were watching them watch the returns come in and then talk about it in real time, which in terms of actually informing a viewer, I don't know that there's that much interest to it. I think that one of the difficulties we grapple with across the industry, not just in television, but in every space, is that we are selling a commodity, and that the guy selling popsicles is going to make much more money and have many more return customers than the person selling broccoli. It doesn't really matter that the people need the broccoli and definitely don't need the popsicles. And I think that we have to gauge and judge that and think about that we do have a lot. And to be clear, and then I'll shut up some more on this. Newspapers make these same decisions. The reason we cover crime the way we cover crime is because 30, 40, 50 years ago in two newspaper towns, the way you sold more newspapers than the person across town was at the grisliest, screamingest headline. And was why our newspapers invested all of this infrastructure in police reporting. Not some high-minded journalistic ideal, but because if you got the details of where the wife had gotten stabbed last night, you sold more newspapers the next day. And so a lot of that if what we wanted to do was purely about journalistic reasoning, we would basically only employ investigative reporters. That's not even close to how we operate in our newsrooms. And so I think that I think we all have to grapple sometimes with the trade-offs that we are making. That just because we are doing something and it is journalism does not, in fact, make it the right thing to be doing or the thing that the audience needs.
A couple questions in the chat about the killing of George Floyd. Astead, let me start with you. After his killing, the social protests and riots, give us a couple of things that jumped out for you in terms of how the media responded to that and some of the decisions that the media made at that time, things that you felt were noteworthy or not noteworthy.
Interesting. I mean, I think that at one, we're dealing with a kind of an event that inspired a protest that we have not seen on this scale in decades. And I think that for one, it was just a breaking news event that we saw newspapers, cable news really reorient themselves to reflect of the kind of broad social movements we had here. I'll take the political angle and I'll cede the rest to Wes here. I think that what came out of the political side was really this focus on defunding the police, was the focus on these kind of litmus test issues around policy that I think that was one part of the story. But what I can say I think media actually fails on the political side of this is that you ask Joe Biden, you ask Kamala Harris about that one litmus test issue, and you very rarely push them on what their affirmative plan is to do to make police shootings and police brutality less likely in their administration, right? That there is a reactive measure that says, how would you respond if this happens to in your administration? But we very rarely push them on kind of proactive measures around how they would make them less likely going forward. We very rarely push them on defending their affirmative plan of what to do, rather than just keeping arm's length away from the kind of twittery, buzzy issue that we're focused on. And so I think that there was this period throughout the summer where Biden was going from interview to interview, rejecting the idea that he supported defunding the police. But certainly we know Republicans were trying to push on him. And I was getting frustrated saying, well, what does he support, right? Let's make him talk about the things that he has put on paper around police brutality and police shootings and defend that itself through journal and make him answer questions about that. And I think that sometimes there can be a lack of imagination about this stuff, partly because we don't have journalists who are really well versed in what the activist community is talking about on these issues, and kind of what the kind of truth is around the way policing looks in these communities. And so you can get away with saying the things like, well, I'm going to invest in community policing, and saying, well, how does that stop the next George Floyd from happening? And I think that that's the questions we can be pushing them on, particularly on the political side. And that's just not really what we get. We get a lot of things about enforcement of guidelines and policy, and very little about kind of like prevention of these things from happening in the first place. And I frankly think that a more robust understanding of the issue would push politicians on that question.
Thank you. Great answer. I mean, Wes, maybe I'll ask a follow up to you. And this is from Haley Samsel in our audience, has the media reckoning over race this summer had any significant impact on newsroom diversity or on the industry in general, in your opinion?
I definitely think it's had an impact on the industry. I don't know that it has yet had much impact on newsroom diversity. We've seen some vows in various places, and some people have gotten some jobs. I don't know that we've seen any massive shift yet, although even if it were to come, I would expect that to take some time. I think that among the things I find encouraging are some of the questions being asked, and you're seeing this in some places and not others. One example of this is in Boston at the Globe, our former paper. They have done a few things. One, they're exploring an initiative called the Right to Be Forgotten, in which they're saying that folks who have been party to crime coverage, they were arrested for a DUI last night, X, Y, and Z, right? They're acknowledging that 50 years ago that would appear in the newspaper, you'd be embarrassed for one day, and 10 years after, there's zero chance it would prevent you from getting a job. But in the world we live in today, that's not what exists. That's not how things work. And so they're exploring the idea that can we cover our community, provide an accurate depiction of what happens, but does everything need to live in perpetuity on the internet this way? If it's in our archives, it's in the paper, what is the impact on the people who we cover in this new era of technology, which I think is something that's very important for us to look at. We're seeing places like WYYY in Philadelphia, where they're implementing things where they're tracking the sources they're quoting in their daily news coverage, both to build a database of folks they talk to, but also to make sure that they're hearing from a variety of voices. I think that's really important because what we don't always appreciate, or we pretend not to know, is that we, the media, often are the ones who make the experts. By the nature of being quoted in the media, you then get quoted in the media more, right? And suddenly you are a person who gets quoted in the media and therefore gets more grants and more fellowships and bigger jobs. And so when we quote the same four white guys, guess who gets to keep being the experts, right? I was looking at a piece recently where we wanted to bring in an expert voice on something, and the first two people my editor suggested were two unquestionable experts on this who were kind of white guys. And I was like, I don't really need either of these people in my piece. And it took me 20 minutes to find a black guy practitioner of the thing we were writing about, who had written a book on the direct question, and a woman who ran a whole center on this exact question we were asking. Right? Now, were either of them in the same big sexy jobs and therefore coming to the mind of this editor? No, not necessarily. But actually they were better experts for the thing. And I would not have found them. My story would have been underserved had I not explicitly went to go look for them. So I think we have to understand and think about things like that. I do think there's a lot of smart conversations happening in our industry. I think a lot of these are far overdue. That none of this is new, that we can go back and read the Kerner Commission report 60 years ago, and it said all the exact same things that I'm getting in trouble for saying on Twitter in 2020. And so I think that, unfortunately, we have to actually make this a priority in our industry if we believe it's journalistic imperative. And I believe it's journalistic imperative. We cover our communities, we cover our nation better when our newsrooms look like our nation, look like our communities. Bring in that sourcing, bring in that expertise, bring in that thinking and those ideas, both in terms of our public-facing product and in terms of our internal conversations. And for too long, too many of our newsrooms have been having a token here or there, but not actually complicating our staffing and our leadership in the ways required to really reflect the nation we're supposed to be covering.
Last word I'll give to Astead, and it really builds on that point. And this is a question from one of our brilliant high school fellows, Skylar Morales. She asks really about the role that social media might play and how it intersects with politics in the future, especially with the voice social media gives to young people and minority communities who in the past have typically been marginalized. Do you think that social media can provide some avenues towards an amplification of voices?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that what we have seen are institutions that have historically only listened to a small segment of voices be pushed on particular topics because you have young folks, you have people who are historically unheard, having an avenue and ways to push them. I think it also has given journalists themselves a voice that is outside of their institution, right? And so there are things that are coming from Astead that may not have come from the New York Times, right? And I think that sometimes makes our institutions uncomfortable because they would like to have a kind of monopoly on your voice and your work. But I think it's also a way that particularly journalists of color and other folks have been able to push the industry at large and sometimes push their own institutions. But what I think that when we think about politics going forward, it is unquestionable that one of the divides that we see within the political universe is, is the online and offline community. I mean, there is, and that is not just Twitter. I would say Facebook's probably a bigger question about that when we talk about politics. But I think that what we do have is a growing segment of young people who are coming to a shared understanding of political thought that are increasingly part of the electorate. And that's going to really matter. And so while we have currently an administration and a kind of democratic politics that has taken pride in rejecting that, that becomes harder and harder every year we move on and every cycle we move on, because it's not just that those young people are aging into a kind of voting age that's going to be more important, but they're aging into a kind of political consensus that pushes aside some of the things that typical politicians have relied upon. And so I think that that's going to be a big question that we have going forward, and it's going to be a challenge for journalists to cover. I don't think that that's inherent that it goes in one direction, right? These are things that are fluid and can shift as time goes on. But I do think that we know that young people, that people of color, are part of the growing majority of Americans that is to come, and that can sometimes be in conflict with both the way that our institutions have covered politics and the way that our political system has valued certain voices over others. And so that is going to be the growing question of America as we go forward. Can this rising multiracial tide be reflected in our political power? And is journalism ready to cover that?
Fantastic. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. That was fascinating. Wesley Lowery from 60 Minutes and CBS News, Astead Herndon from the New York Times, Russell Contreras from the AP in Albuquerque. Gentlemen, please come and join us in Santa Fe next year when we get back in person. We'd love to have you, and I know that so much is going to happen and change during that time or during this coming year. So thanks so much for taking the time to do this. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Thank
you, guys.